And we were just starting a new group of invertebrates, the Cnidaria. And Cnidaria used to be called Selenorata. Selenorata means hollow gut. Cnidaria refers to a type of cell that they have. But these are basically things like jellyfish and corals and sea anemones and some organisms you can just barely see with your naked eye called hydras. And if we think about sea anemones and coral, the best way to think about them is they're basically, think of turning a jellyfish upside down. So sea anemones and corals kind of look like tin cans. And instead of having tentacles hanging down below the body, the tentacles stick up above the body. Now, cnidarians are only found in aquatic environments. We don't find them in terrestrial environments, so they don't live on land. That's what terrestrial is. And we don't have any species that are really parasitic. So we find them in water. They're an unusual group because they possess radial symmetry. Remember what we said the other day. If you cut a diameter through their body, then any two halves should be approximately equal. Remember, we said not exactly equal. So here's a jellyfish. You can see some of the main structures. You can see the tentacles hanging down below. This structure in the middle is a manubrium. And if you've had human anatomy, you might remember that the mandible is one of the jaw bones. So the manubrium is kind of their mouth. And what they do is when they catch organisms in their tentacles, we'll talk in a little bit about how they do that, but when they catch organism in their tentacles, they pull them up and they put them in the mouth. And then you may be able to see at the top of the mouth, there are some lines that spread out throughout the body. What we see is that cnidarians don't have a separate digestive system and a circulatory system like people do. Cnidarians have a cardiovascular, not a cardiovascular, a gastrovascular system. And gastro means stomach, vascular refers to, in a person, the blood vessels. So inside this structure here, this kind of darker white and these lines that radiate out from it, what we see is the food travels through these kind of canals in the body and it's digested and then it diffuses into neighboring cells. And when we look at jellyfish, jellyfish also have 4 reproductive organs called gonads. You can see the gonads, the kind of the bright white circles up towards the top. So think of cnidarians as having a sac-like body. The sac either hangs down like a jellyfish or it stands up like in a sea anemone or a coral. Now, cnidarians are diploblastic. And when we say that they're diploblastic, di means 2. So this means that their body develops from 2 tissues in the embryo. And actually as adults, or mature organisms, I'm not sure we would call them adults, actually as mature organisms, they continue to have 2 layers of tissue. They have an outer layer that's called the epidermis. And whenever we see epidermis in any type of organism, the epidermis is always the layer of cells on the outside of the body. Sometimes it's several layers. In jellyfish, it's 1. Now, if we look at the jellyfish, some of the epidermal cells are contractile, which means they shorten like muscle cells in a person do. And some of the epidermal cells act like nerve cells. So they transmit nerve impulses from one part of the body to another. Now, the nerve cells that we find in a jellyfish are very different than the nerve cells we find in something like you. These nerve cells form what's called a nerve net, a kind of a crisscrossing network. And there's no directional orientation. What we mean by that is if we look at a nerve cell that's horizontal that's running from right to left. It can transmit a nerve impulse from the right to the left, or it can transmit a nerve impulse from the left to the right. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but if we look at the nerve cells in your body, nerve cells in your body are not are not bidirectional, I should say. They can't transmit signals in two ways. If we look at your body, nerve cells either transmit signals from the outer parts of the body into your central nervous system, or some nerve cells transmit messages from the central nervous system to the outer parts of your body. But in your body, nerve cells can't transmit signals both ways. So jellyfish do have nerve cells that can transmit signals in both directions. Now, they don't have a brain, so that's why I said they could transmit a signal to the right, they could transmit a signal to the left. So they can communicate with cells on either side of them, but there really is no brain. Now, keep in mind, you may have seen some advertisements for over-the-counter pharmaceutical called Prevagen. And there's some evidence, it's not real strong, but there's some evidence that Prevagen can help your short-term memory. This is one of the things that starts to deteriorate for people who have dementia. So there's some evidence that Prevagen may help you avoid or slow down the progress of dementia. There's not really much evidence at this point that for a person with normal nerve function, if you're not suffering from dementia or getting close to that point, there's really not much evidence that it would help you study better for a test or, remember the names of all your 10 cousins for the family reunion next week. So notice that one of the things I've said a couple times this semester and will repeat, but we have to keep an open mind when we look at different types of organisms. Here we have an organism that doesn't have a brain. It doesn't have a spinal cord, so it doesn't have any central nervous system, yet it makes a chemical that does affect the central nervous system in certain ways. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, this group actually gets its name from a third type of epidermis cell. And this is an epidermis cell called a cnidoblast, or it's sometimes called a cnidocyte. Remember, cyte always means cell. And these cells contain a stinging capsule called a nematocyst. And this nematocyst is going to be how organisms in this group catch their prey. There are none of these organisms that are vegetarians. They're all carnivorous. We sometimes think of carnivores as lions eating zebras, but it could be jellyfish or coral eating smaller organisms that are animals too. So if we look at the tentacle, here's the tentacle, and these red cells represent different types of epidermis cells. And then the blue cells in here are these cnidoblasts, or cnidocytes. So if we magnify one of these, we see that there's a couple of parts to this cell. There's a trigger structure. There's something that if the prey organism bumps up against this cnidoblast is going to sting it. Now keep in mind, I just said they're predators. When we think of predators, again, we think of something like a lion. Lions chase their prey. Cnidoblasts don't really chase their prey. Their prey has to pretty much swim into their tentacles. If the prey swims into their tentacles, the tentacles fire automatically. So if you brush against this trigger, if you're out swimming, these nematocysts will sting you. And there are actually 2 or 3 people a year who drown because there are some jellyfish that when they sting you, the nematocyst, the stuff that actually comes out of this cell and hits you, In some cases, the nematocyst contains a toxin that's paralytic. So if you're swimming in the ocean and you're a couple of 100 feet off the shore, showing off for your friends, and you get stung by a jellyfish and paralyzed, you may drown before anybody realizes you're in trouble and before anybody can get out there and bring you back to shore. So we have this little trigger mechanism. We have an operculum, which is kind of like a lid, and the operculum is closed. But when the trigger mechanism gets pushed, that opens the operculum. And inside, we have our cnidoblast or nematocyst. And what this is it's a little barbed structure. So it's got barbs. And then it has a long, sticky filament. Now, what happens is when this comes out, sometimes the barb will stick in the prey. If the prey is very small, the filament wraps around it. And notice, you can get stung by a jellyfish even after the jellyfish is dead. Sometimes jellyfish die and they wash up on the beach. And keep in mind, pushing this trigger, getting stung, is really a physical process. All you have to do is bend that trigger. So if the jellyfish died recently and it hasn't really decayed, if the cells are intact and you step on a jellyfish tentacle, you can actually get stung. And depending on the type of jellyfish, it can be very painful. You may be limping for a couple of days. Now, notice one of these cnidoblasts with one nematocyst is not going to do very much. But if you notice this tentacle, and this is just a small part of this tentacle, this is just the tip, this tentacle has lots of these cells. So if a prey organism bumps into a tentacle, it probably gets stung with these nematocysts several times. And it probably bumps into more than one tentacle too. So one of these may not have very much impact, but several of them can stun an organism. And then what happens is the tentacles pull this in, and in the center of all the tentacles, this is where the mouth is located. So they pull it into the mouth, and then that gastrovascular cavity branches off from the mouth. Some of it goes down into the main part of the body. Some of it goes out into the tentacles. So the food is digested in this gastrovascular cavity. And then as it's digested, the nutrients diffuse into the neighboring cells. So notice this gastrovascular cavity kind of acts like a digestive system. This is where digestion takes place, but it also acts like a circulatory system because it also distributes the products of digestion around the body. In your case, you digest the food in your digestive system, but then it has to get into your blood to get transported around the body. The digestive system is fairly limited in your body. So when we look at these organisms, now notice this would be an example of something like a sea anemone because it's basically a jellyfish that's upside down. But when we look at these organisms, this is how they all capture their prey. So when we look at these, here's a diagram of the gastrovascular cavity. So we have this layer of cells on the outside called the epidermis, and we talked about several specialized cells in there. On the inside, we have a layer of cells called the gastrodermis. And while there are all sorts of different cells out in the epidermis, in the gastrodermis, the cells are basically all the same. But because this epidermis has lots of different types of cells, this is considered to be a true tissue. So when we talk about cnidarians, we say that they have a tissue level of organization. Remember with sponges, we said sponges are really just colonial organisms. Remember they had those pinocytes on the outside, they had choanocytes on the inside, but they don't have different types of pinocytes. They don't have different types of choanocytes. So to be a tissue, you have to be able to have different types of cells. Now, when we look at these organisms, so notice this would be a jellyfish type of form. This is one of the keys that we see with most animals. They digest their food extracellularly.
I'll be like disappointed because.
And when we say extracellularly, this means that these organisms don't digest their food inside a cell. Extra means outside. So they digest their food inside a cell if they're a sponge. All other animals digest their food extracellularly. Again, one more reason, remember when we talked about sponges, the Porifera the other day, we said that they're really different from all other animals. So this is another example of that. Now, in between the epidermis and the gastrodermis, they have a layer called the mesoglia. And the mesoglia is somewhat similar to that mesohyle that we saw in the sponges. We don't really see cells in this layer, but there are a lot of protein fibers, including a lot of collagen, which is a protein that's found in human skin, for instance. There are also some things called proteoglycans, which you can tell from the name. Remember glycogen and glycolysis. These molecules are proteins and carbohydrates. Usually they're long chains of carbohydrates connected by very short chains of amino acids. And there's also some water in here. So again, like the mesohyle in sponges, this layer has a kind of a jelly-like consistency. It's somewhat solid, but it's not a solid that has a definitive shape. Now, despite that, the protein fibers are relatively stiff and rigid, so they help give the body its shape. Now, cnidarians are unusual in the sense that they have a life cycle that, at least in most species, involves something that we call an alternation of generations. And when we have an alternation of generations, we have two distinct body plans or body forms, sometimes more than two in a few unusual cases. So one stage is something called a polyp stage. And a polyp is basically something like a sea anemone. So we turn our jellyfish upside down, it's anchored to the surface. We can't see it, but in the middle of all these tentacles, there's a mouth. And this is what we see typically with sea anemones. Now, yesterday I told you, why cartoons are not good biologically, but I will tell you, there are fish called clownfish, and clownfish are immune to the stinging cells in sea anemones. So if you saw Finding Nemo, there really are clownfish that live in the middle of the tentacles. Sea anemones turn out to be pretty sloppy eaters. So, when a sea anemone pulls a fish into its mouth, little pieces of fish sometimes drift out of the mouth. So clownfish get to scavenge these fish that the sea anemones don't eat very completely. Now, what does the sea anemone get out of this? Well, some fish get lured into the tentacles, chasing the clownfish. The clownfish are immune to the tentacles and their stings, so it doesn't bother them. The other fish, not so much. So when we look at cnidarians, many of them have a polyp stage, like a sea anemone, and they have a medusa stage, which is the part that is like a jellyfish. Now, when the polyp stage reproduces, it reproduces asexually. So we know that means mitosis is involved when we're talking about animals, and it produces medusa buds. The medusa stage is the second type of body plan, and the medusa stage is going to reproduce sexually, and when it reproduces, it's going to make a polyp. So the polyp reproduces and makes a medusa. The medusa reproduces and makes a polyp. So here's a colonial polyp. It's a genus called Obelia. And there's a central stalk And then there are all sorts of polyps that grow out of the side of this stalk. And we see two basic types of polyps. There are feeding polyps, and the feeding polyps have tentacles and they have a mouth. And this feeding polyp essentially is a miniature sea anemone. But there are also reproductive polyps, and the reproductive polyps produce medusa buds. So think of, we've talked about sponges can reproduce by budding. We've talked about yeast could reproduce by budding when we discussed fungi. So this medusa bud is produced by mitosis. Keep in mind that these organisms are 2N, and then one at a time, the buds are released, and the buds are small jellyfish, or sometimes instead of calling them jellyfish, we just call them a medusa for their body shape. Now the jellyfish have ovaries and testes, and although this diagram labels them in different medusa forms, jellyfish have ovaries and testes in the same body, like many animals. So the eggs are released into the water, the sperm are released into the water, the sperm swim to the eggs, and the egg is fertilized. Notice it develops through several stages. One of those stages is a blastula. Remember when we talked about animals in general terms the other day, we said all animals develop from a stage called the blastula. The blastula eventually forms something called a planula larva. And the body of the planula larva is covered with cilia. And even though it's called free swimming, it's very small. So it can swim a little bit under its own power, but mostly it drifts with the currents and the tides. Eventually, this planula larva settles down and begins growing into a colony of polyps again. So we're back at the beginning of the life cycle. Well, I mean, if you want to be picky, since this is a cycle, you can begin anywhere you want. So when we look at the various groups of cnidarians, in some of them, the medusa stage of the life cycle is dominant. And when we say dominant, keep in mind, all we mean is, if you look at this organism, it's probably going to be in that stage of the life cycle. Sometimes that stage of the life cycle is bigger, but doesn't mean that that stage dominates the other stage in a physical sense. So in some groups of cnidarians, the medusa stage is dominant. In some groups of cnidarians, the polyp stage is dominant. And over long periods of evolutionary time, there are some groups of cnidarians that have completely lost the polyp stage, and they only live as medusa. And there are some that have completely lost the medusa stage and only live as polyps. And it's not always very easy to look at a cnidarian and see what type of body form you're looking at. You might have heard of a large jellyfish called a Portuguese man-o'-war. Portuguese man-o'-war can have tentacles that can be 20, 30 feet long. If we look at Portuguese man-o'-wars, they look like a jellyfish. But when we study them, Portuguese man-o'-wars are actually colonial polyps. But the polyps are arranged into a medusa type shape. So when we look at these organisms, we see both lifestyles. So besides sea anemone and jellyfish, the other very common member of this group is coral. Coral are cnidarians in the polyp stage. I just mentioned a moment ago, some species have lost the medusa stage. A lot of the coral fit into this category. And from an ecological standpoint, coral are very important. It's estimated that about 25% of all ocean fish either reproduce or live in the coral reefs. If they live there, they usually reproduce there too. So that's a quarter of all the fish species. And in the United States, people don't necessarily eat fish all that often. But in some other countries, fish are a major source of protein in the diet. So coral reefs are important for that reason. In the long term, there's another reason that coral is important. As far as geological engineers can tell, most petroleum deposits where we get gasoline, most petroleum deposits come from living organisms being buried in coral reefs. If they get buried so quickly, the body doesn't decompose, then the organic materials get buried under the mud, under the sediments that drift to the bottom of the ocean floor. And over millions of years, the pressure of all the layers above them compresses them from whatever organic materials were in the body to petroleum. So when we look at these organisms, they're important for a couple of reasons. Now we're going to end up looking at 3 different groups of worms. The first one we're going to look at is the platyhelminthes. Platy means flat, helminthes is worms. So these are literally the flatworms. And they include 2 main groups. One that you've heard of probably, 3 main groups, I'm sorry. Tapeworms, which I think you've probably heard of, flukes, and planarians. And the reason that flatworms get their name is because their body is flattened. And it's always flattened in a dorsoventral direction. Now that's basically from the stomach side to the back side of a person. With planaria, it's kind of hard to say that they have a backside. This is a cross section of a flatworm called a planaria. And we can see the pharynx. And notice the pharynx has a hollow area on the inside. The pharynx is a muscular organ. And at least in planaria, they can actually push their pharynx out of their mouth. And the advantage of this is this muscular organ, when they push it out of their mouth, they can use it kind of like a vacuum cleaner hose, and they can suck up debris around them. Now, planaria tend to live on rocks and logs that have fallen into the water. Planaria are just barely visible with your naked eye. So when we look at planaria, what we see is this is how they scrounge up their food. They crawl along a rock and they use their pharynx to suck up pieces of algae, microscopic organisms like bacteria that might be attached to the rock. Now, one of the things that we see with these organisms is they're bilaterally symmetrical. All the other groups that we're going to talk about also fit into this category. The kind of 2 unusual groups in terms of their body symmetry are the sponges, which some people say are radially symmetrical, some people say are asymmetrical, and the cnidarians, the group that we just looked at, they have radial symmetry. So if we look at animals with bilateral symmetry, the right and left halves are approximately mirror images of each other. As we said the other day, if you think of a person, there are a few differences. The gallbladder and the appendix are on the right side, the heart is up more on the left side, but mostly our right and left sides are pretty good mirror images of each other. Now, since these organisms are bilaterally symmetrical, they have 2 longitudinal nerve cords that run the length of their body, similar to a spinal cord in us, except we only have 1 spinal cord. So they have one on the right side of their body, one on the left side of their body. And up in the head area, these longitudinal nerve cords join with a cluster of cells called a ganglion, and they form a brain. It's not a very big brain. It's not real impressive. If you put flatworms that have these longitudinal nerve cords and brains, if you put them in a maze, and keep in mind the maze has to be very simple. The maze is shaped like a T. So basically there's one turn in the maze. You either go right or left. and you put liver at one end of the maze, say the left side, planarians can learn that they need to turn to the left to get a reward of liver. Planarians really like eating liver. Some species have eye spots on their head so they can detect the direction that light is coming from. The eyes don't form images. So, you know, if we were in class, we would be looking at planaria under the microscope, and sometimes people get creeped out. They feel like they're looking at them. They're not looking at you. They can't see you, but they can detect light, and they don't like light. So they usually move away from light. So they can tell the direction light is coming from. They can't really see anything. Now, the cnidarians were diploblastic, flatworms, and again, all the other groups that we're going to look at are triploblastic. If we look at an embryo of a flatworm as it's developing, there are 3 tissue layers that form in the embryo. There's something called the ectoderm, and ecto means outside. So this is going to form the outer part of the body. There's the endoderm, and the endoderm is going to form the inner lining of the body. So when we say the inner lining, think about the lining of, they have a gastrovascular cavity, just like the cnidaria did. And in between them, there's a mesoderm. And usually the mesoderm, even though if we look at the embryo, it's the last tissue to develop, usually this makes up most of the embryo. So here we can see 3 different types of bodies. Blue is generally used to represent the ectoderm. Yellow is used to represent the endoderm. It's kind of hard to see the yellow on this one. It's inside this little orange circle. And orange is used to represent the mesoderm. Now, if we look at flatworms, flatworms have a body that's referred to as acoelomate. And acoelomate means the body is solid. This white area in the middle is really the inside of the digestive system. Now, there are some disadvantages to having a solid body. If you think about it, if you press against the outer blue on this coelomate body on the very left of our diagram, if you press against that, that force gets transmitted through all the cells of the body. And it can disrupt digestion because eventually those forces get transmitted to the digestive system, to the gut. Some organisms have a body cavity called a coelom. So if we look at the middle diagram, here's our yellow endoderm. Inside here, this is the gut cavity. This is where the food would pass as it's eating. Notice there's another cavity out around the endoderm. And this area is between the endoderm and the mesoderm. Now, there are a couple of advantages to having a coelom. First of all, if you push against the outer body wall, this blue, the coelom is going to absorb some of that force. The coelom is usually filled with water or fluid that's mostly water. So think about it, the swimming pool, if you've ever played with somebody, you hit somebody underwater, your hand doesn't really move as fast underwater because the water slows it down. So here, the coelom provides some physical support to the body. It also does something else. If the animal eats a lot, the digestive system can actually expand. It can get larger, so it can hold more food. Notice on the left, for animals that are acoelomate, they can only eat a limited amount of food because their digestive system really can't expand. Why? Because there are cells all the way around it. Now, organisms that have this type of coelom are called pseudocoelomate. And pseudo means fake or false. And it's pseudocoelomate if the coelom is between the endoderm on the inside and the mesoderm on the outside. Other animals have a coelom that's between 2 layers of mesoderm. And these organisms are sometimes called eucoelomate. Eu means good or real. They have a real coelom. And I think it's more than a coincidence that, you know, eucoelomate animals have their coelom between two layers of mesoderm. Guess what? Humans are eucoelomate. You know, if you were a roundworm, you might think that this is a better system. But since this is a system we have, these are animals that have a good coelom. Now, I mentioned that this coelom does a couple of things. It protects the internal organs from outside forces. It allows the internal organs to expand or grow. And this expansion can be temporary, like if you eat more food. You know, when people get a tummy ache, one of the reasons that they get a tummy ache is if you really pig out and you eat so much food that your stomach can't stretch to accommodate anymore. That's what gives you a tummy ache. One of the things, there's more than one. But notice this also allows internal organs to expand on a much longer basis. When a woman gets pregnant, her uterus increases in size because that's where the embryo attaches. That's where the placenta is formed. So, you know, this growth in the size of the organs could be small, like when your urinary bladder fills with urine. When you eat, your stomach is pretty small when there's nothing in it. It can get larger when you eat, but it could also be a longer term expansion of the organs, like if you're pregnant. So when we look at this, we'll come back to this later when we look at some animals that are coelomate, that have either a pseudocoelom or a eucoelom. Now, notice that these organisms also have a digestive system that only has one opening. And that opening, since there's only one opening into the digestive system, that opening has to work as a mouth and as an anus. And when we see a digestive system with only one opening, this is called an incomplete digestive system. And basically here, this digestive system starts with the pharynx. The pharynx is kind of a tube, and down at the end of the tube is the mouth. So we can't see it very well from here, but this mouth is, as I said, kind of like the opening on a vacuum cleaner hose. So this pharynx scrapes up food, sucks it into the opening, and then this black color is the gastrovascular system. So remember what we said with the cnidarians a moment ago? This puts out branches that go all the way through the body. So as these branches go all the way through the body, not only does digestion occur inside this cavity, but then the nutrients diffuse out to neighboring cells. So there's no circulatory system really. Now notice, having a digestive system that only has one opening is kind of a disadvantage. You know, if you think about it in nature, one problem that most living organisms have, most animals, is getting enough food. If you have a digestive system with only one opening, you have to stop eating every once in a while. Because any organism, when it eats food, there are certain parts of the food that it can't digest, that it can't break down into nutrients and absorb into its body. In people, this is what comes out our anus as the feces. But if you only have one opening to your digestive system, you have to stop eating every once in a while, because if you're a planaria, you have to eliminate some waste through the mouth at the end of the pharynx. So you can't eat constantly. Now, it might seem silly to say that's a disadvantage, but considering the fact that for many animals, starvation is a constant problem, that is very bad news. There's another disadvantage to having a system with only one opening. Think about this kind of pointed black area right in here. Notice that when the planaria is eating food, that food comes in and it's moving in this direction. But when it's eliminating waste, what's left of the food is moving in this direction. Well, when it's eliminating the waste, the things that it couldn't digest from what it brought into its gastrovascular cavity, that material is in a different condition. It's been partially broken down by digestive enzymes. Um, so what this means is for any location along the gastrovascular cavity, when the food passes by, depending on whether it's coming in to be digested or going out to be eliminated, um, the food has different qualities. Well, what's so bad about that? It means that the cells around this gastrovascular cavity can't be as specialized as they might be. Why? Because the food isn't always in the same condition. It depends on whether it's going in or going out. And usually with most organ systems, what we find is the more that cells can specialize, the more efficient they can be at extracting nutrients. So this is not a super efficient way to digest your food. You know, if you look at a human, the food comes in the mouth, goes out the anus. When the food goes through the stomach, it's always in the same condition. When the food goes through the small intestine, it's always in the same condition. When the food goes through the large intestine, it's always in the same condition. So that means that these organs can be more specialized because when the food gets to them, they always need to do the same thing to it. Instead of maybe it's coming in, maybe it's coming out, we don't have to worry about that when we have a complete digestive system with a mouth and anus. Now again, Platyhelminthes contains a lot of species that are parasitic. And as we've seen with most parasites, flatworm parasites tend to have a complex life cycle. So let's look at a tapeworm. So if we look at a tapeworm, tapeworms really are very thin, like tape. They're not as wide as tape. If you imagine taking a normal piece of Scotch tape and, if you would look up near what's called the scolex, kind of similar to the head, if you would look up there, the body is probably only about as wide as maybe a fourth of a strip of regular Scotch tape. If you look down at the opposite end where the body is wider, now it's probably about as wide as maybe 3/4 of a strip of tape. Well, if we look at the scolex has a couple of things. It has a structure called a rostellum, and the rostellum has hooks on it. And below that, there are some suckers. Now, the number of hooks and the number of suckers varies from one species of tapeworm to another. And what a tapeworm does is a tapeworm uses these hooks and suckers. If we're talking about a tapeworm that's in a human, it uses these to attach to the inside walls of your small intestine. Even though when we're in grade school, we mostly hear about the stomach when we talk about the digestive system, most of your food actually gets broken down into nutrients, and the nutrients get absorbed into your body in your small intestine. Now, behind the scolex, there's a very short head, and then there are some segments called proglottids. And the neck makes the proglottids. They're made by mitosis. So notice this is an asexual cell division. And what we see is these proglottids, if we look over here on the left, get progressively larger as we get further and further away from the scolex. Now, why do they get larger? Because this organism is living in your small intestine and it's absorbing your nutrients. So as it absorbs your nutrients, these proglottids get bigger. Now, what's in these proglottids? Not much. Proglottids contain reproductive organs. They contain ovaries and testes. you know, if you're a tapeworm and you get in Mr. Griffith's small intestine, the odds of finding Mr. Right or Ms. Right, depending on your gender, would be pretty slim. So the way that tapeworms avoid this is tapeworms have both male reproductive organs and female reproductive organs. Now, notice the testes make sperm, and they make the sperm by meiosis. And the ovaries make eggs, and they make the eggs by meiosis. And then the sperm fertilize the eggs inside the same proglottid. Some sperm can be released and can go in and out through the genital pore. But in most species, fertilization is just inside this proglottid. Now, you might think, since the eggs and the sperm are both made by the same organism, that, you know, this is going to be asexual reproduction. But because they're made by meiosis, this is sexual reproduction. Imagine that our tapeworm is heterozygous for some characteristic. Then it could pass down the dominant allele in an egg or a sperm. It could pass down the recessive allele. So we would see a Punnett square very similar to what we normally see when we have two heterozygous animals mate. So these proglottids get bigger because as they absorb nutrients from your small intestine, the fertilized eggs use these nutrients, and the fertilized eggs get larger and larger and larger. Now, eventually what happens is these proglottids at the end tear off from the body. They might tear off just because they're so far away, there's physical stress. They might tear off because they get torn off by food moving through your digestive system. But if you think about the fact that you're living in your small intestine, in your digestive system, after the small intestine comes the large intestine, and then the rectum, and then the anus. So these proglottids with the eggs come out in your feces. And that's actually one of the ways that you can check to see if you have a tapeworm infection. You can check your feces because the proglottids that come out are usually large enough that they're visible. Now, how do they get back inside a person? Well, if you look in this part of the world, say we're looking at someone in Chicago who has a tapeworm. Okay, so the eggs come out in their feces. You flush your feces down the toilet. Where does the toilet take your feces? If you live in the Chicago area, anyway. Does anyone know?
Sewage?
To sewage. And where does that sewage eventually dump them?
Is it that place that's like, if you're like on I-94, is it like over there?
That's a little bit later in the process. The first place they dump them is in a location called Lake Michigan.
Oh.
The place that you're thinking about, the place that you're thinking about is a water treatment plant.
Oh, yeah, it always like stinks over there.
Yes. So
Yeah.
Here's what they do at the water treatment plant. They have some filters, and I mentioned these proglottids are decent sized. They have some filters. They have bacteria that break down some of the bad chemicals in here. So they run this water that comes from Lake Michigan through a bunch of processes. And then this water is what goes into your drinking water, into your faucets. However, the process is good enough that these proglottids are gone. And what you see by some of these places, like the one on I-94, is there are these big kind of, usually they're rectangular fields. And this is what stinks, because what's in these big rectangular fields, and if you would look closer, they're actually kind of like swimming pools. They've got some depth to them. This is where they put all the junk that they filter out of the water. Now, they produce a lot of this stuff. It's called sludge. What do they do with this sludge after they make it? Well, they sell it to farmers for fertilizer. So this sludge that we make up here in Chicago is sold mostly to farmers in central Illinois. So they're going to spread it on their corn fields or their soybean fields or their wheat fields, whatever they happen to be growing, because it's good fertilizer. It contains a lot of organic materials that will help plants grow. Now, unfortunately, the proglottids don't fit into that category. Now, the proglottids eventually deteriorate, but the eggs have a very hard, a very sturdy shell around them. Now, for most farmers, what do you do at the end of the growing season? You harvest your corn, but think about what people eat from corn. We eat the ears of corn. You know, if you've ever driven down I-55 towards St. Louis, you know that there's a lot more to the corn plant than just those ears. There's the corn stalks, there's these big husks that you might get occasionally if you buy your corn and you have to husk it yourself. But after the farmers harvest the ears of corn, most farmers own some pigs and cows. So what do they do with their pigs and cows? They let them loose in their cornfields so they can graze on what's called the stubble, what's left of the plants. Now, pigs and cows are really, really sloppy eaters. Cows eat nails, they eat roof shingles. Basically, they bend over and they take a mouthful of stuff that contains some plant material. So when these cows and pigs are out grazing on the fields, what do they eat besides the stuff that the farmer wants them to eat? They eat some eggs from tapeworms. Now, the tapeworm egg gets inside their body, and inside their body, the egg burrows through the wall of their digestive system, and then it floats in the cow's blood or the pig's blood or a fish's blood. There are lots of animals that have tapeworms. It floats in the animal's blood until the blood goes by some muscles. And then this baby tapeworm can get out and it burrows into a muscle and it forms a cyst. Now, when people eat meat, we're eating muscle. So if your meat is well cooked, cooking it fairly well destroys the cysts. But some people like their meat rare, and there are some types of meat, and there are some places of the world where meat is eaten raw, where it's considered a delicacy to eat raw meat. Well, if the meat is raw, then those cysts from the tapeworms are still in there and they're undamaged. So if you eat those cysts, what happens? Well, the cyst, as I said, is very strong. So your stomach has some strong acids in it. Those acids start to break down the cysts. And by the time it gets to your small intestine, the tapeworm comes out of the cyst and attaches to your intestinal wall. So if you eat, something like sushi, which sometimes contains raw fish, or if you eat other types of food that contains raw meat or meat that isn't cooked very well, there's a possibility that you could pick up a tapeworm from that. Now, most tapeworms produce a chemical. So the chemical prevents other tapeworms of the same type from getting into you. So if you get a beef tapeworm, something that you get from eating cow meat, you're not going to get 40 beef tapeworms. But in some cases, you might have a beef tapeworm and you could get a fish tapeworm or something at the same time. So really, if you eat a lot of raw meat or undercooked meat, you might want to check your stool occasionally to see if you have proglottids in it. There are some medications you can take to eliminate tapeworms. There's an old wives' tale that says if you have a tapeworm, you just go on a very strict diet and the tapeworm will come farther and farther up in your digestive system, and eventually the tapeworm scolex, the head, will stick out of your mouth and you can grab it and pull it out. That's an old wives' tale. That doesn't work. The cyst in the meat can go through the acids in your stomach, But once the tapeworm is in your small intestine, it can't survive those acids. And we don't have any evidence that if you're not eating a lot, they go further up into the body. Now notice tapeworms and some other species of animals that we'll talk about have a characteristic that's sometimes called parasitic degeneration. Now, we don't mean they're degenerate and disgusting. Think about this Scolex again. Notice that all we see in here pretty much is reproductive organs. There's no digestive system. Why don't tapeworms have to have a digestive system? The planarians, the free-living flatworms, have a digestive system. They have that gastrovascular cavity that we were talking about earlier. Why don't tapeworms need one? Oh, they're living in your small intestine. You're digesting their food for them. Why should they waste time and energy building digestive organs when you're doing all the work for them? In your small intestine, you're breaking carbohydrates down into monosaccharides. They can absorb those monosaccharides. You're breaking proteins down to amino acids. They can absorb those amino acids. You're breaking triglycerides down to monoglycerides and fatty acids. They can absorb those. So they don't need their own digestive system. They're co-opting yours. Now, there are some parts of the world where it's very popular to eat raw meat. And it's estimated in some parts of Asia and the Pacific that as much as 20% of the population probably has tapeworm. The numbers aren't that high in most industrialized countries. But you want to keep that in mind if you ever visit foreign cultures and have an opportunity to taste some of their unique dishes. You might want to be a little bit cautious about what you're tasting. So keep in mind when we look at tapeworms, if you go back to the early 1900s, tapeworm were actually sold in diet pills. And the idea was that you could eat a tapeworm and lose weight. And most people who have tapeworms are relatively skinny. But keep in mind, the tapeworm really is as thin as a piece of tape. And remember, I said the body isn't even as wide as a piece of tape. So your tapeworm might not eat all that many calories. So don't try to impress anybody by eating tapeworms and losing weight, because I know you probably won't be surprised by this, but of course, just like anything else nowadays, guess what? If you go online and you look up tapeworm diet, you can find places that still will sell you tapeworm pills. However, there are some problems. Keep in mind that some people who have tapeworms get diseases like beriberi and rickets and scurvy. Rickets is a disease you get when you don't have enough vitamin D. Scurvy is a disease you get when you don't have enough vitamin C. So they sometimes get vitamin deficiency diseases. Now, why would this happen? Well, remember, they're absorbing some of your nutrients. And a lot of people get enough calories in their diet. They won't necessarily be super skinny if they have a tapeworm, but a lot of people just barely get enough vitamin C or some of the B vitamins or vitamin D or vitamin E. So if you have a tapeworm, you might get a disease caused by a deficiency of this vitamin. And depending what the disease is, sometimes we can correct this later in life by giving you vitamin supplements. Sometimes we can't correct it. Sometimes the effects are permanent. If you don't get enough vitamin D, for instance, your bones can actually bend. You can end up with curved bones in your legs. And once they're curved, there's not much we can do about that. There are even more serious problems, which is if you get a tapeworm, tapeworms sometimes burrow into the wrong place. So a tapeworm could attach to your small intestine. That's where they normally attach. But every year, a few people are killed by tapeworms burrowing into their brains and destroying brain tissue. It's not real common, but I'm just saying there's probably, a different way to try to lose weight if that's your goal. Okay, let's see first of all if there are any questions about this. Now notice that tapeworms can get to be extremely long. A tapeworm can be as long as your small intestine. So they can get to be 10, 15 feet long in rare cases. They're not usually that long. Some of the other flatworm parasites, there's a group called the liver flukes. Liver flukes are about as big as a quarter. And although their body is flat, if they get into your liver and they start reproducing, you could end up having hundreds or thousands of them. And if that happens, you're probably going to need a liver transplant. Now, flukes are also a good example of how we don't always plan very well for what might happen in nature. If we look at when Egypt built a dam called the Aswan Dam, they built this dam because the Nile River used to flood every year and cause some damage. And so they thought they would control the flooding. What they didn't take into account when they built the dam was the Nile River flows relatively quickly. When they built the dam, they created a lake, and the water in the lake doesn't flow nearly as rapidly. Why did this matter? Because liver flukes, after they live in humans, their second host is snails. And snails like water that's very slow moving. They don't like water that's rapid moving. So after Egypt built the Aswan Dam, they had a large outbreak of schistosomiasis, which is the disease caused by liver flukes. So let's look at one more group of worms before we leave. Let's look at the phylum Nemata, or Nematoda, or Nemahelminthes. And these are worms that are commonly called roundworms. I'm sorry, got ahead of myself. This includes some things called hookworms, pinworms, filarial worms, guinea worms. You might have heard of heartworms in pets. A lot of biologists think there are as many roundworms as there are arthropods, the species that, is tops on our list of what's been classified and studied. Why do they think that? If we study almost every type of animal, there's at least one species of roundworm that's a parasite in it. So from that point of view, there's probably one roundworm, maybe more than one, for everything else. So here's an example of a roundworm called Loa loa. You can probably see Loa loa here. It's coiled up. Loa loa lives in the blood vessels in the cornea of the human eye. So when people have this, you can actually sometimes see this swimming through their eye. So when we look at these organisms, notice that roundworms are an example of a type of organism called protostomes. Proto means first, stome is mouth. And in protostomes, the first opening in the embryo, something called the blastopore. And notice you can tell by the name that this is something that forms into the blastula, that developmental stage. In protostomes, the first opening becomes the mouth, and the second opening becomes the anus. There's another opening that develops later in development. We'll talk about that later. In deuterostomes, deutero means second. The first opening becomes the anus, and the second opening becomes the mouth. Now, roundworms are protostomes. If you think about the groups that we've talked about so far, the sponges aren't protostomes or deuterostomes because they don't have a digestive system. And if we look at cnidarians and flatworms, they're not protostomes or deuterostomes because their digestive system only has one opening. So we can't talk about whether the first opening is the mouth or the anus because there's only one. So only animals that have a complete digestive system, and to have a complete digestive system, animals have to have a mouth and an anus both. Those are the only animals that are either protostomes or deuterostomes. Now, roundworms have a fluid-filled body cavity. They are pseudocoelomate. So notice this is the first group we've seen that has a coelom. And as we go through the various phyla of animals, one of the things we'll see is when a characteristic first appears, usually we're going to see some version of that characteristic in all the groups we talk about after that. Now, this liquid in the body cavity acts as something that we call a hydroskeleton. And a hydroskeleton is similar to something called a hydraulic pump. Now, you may never have used a hydraulic pump, but in a hydraulic pump, you have a handle that you push by hand, or most hydraulic pumps that you have an electrical current hooked up to it that pumps it, and you pump water someplace. And if you've had chemistry, you probably remember that water is fairly dense. And so if you pump water someplace, you can use it to move objects, or you can use it to lift objects. And so in roundworms, that hollow area in the middle of their body, that coelom, is filled with fluid, and this acts as a kind of skeleton. Now, mostly it acts as a skeleton in one way. It allows muscle cells to pull on it. So this gives the organism a more efficient type of movement, well, for most of them. Roundworms only have longitudinal muscles, and these longitudinal muscles run the entire length of their body. So from one end of the body to the other. So if we look at these organisms, what we see is because the muscles run the entire length of their body, they have a really weird method of movement. It looks quite unusual.
In this video, we're looking at nematode worms. This is Turbotrix, called the vinegar eel. Now, nematodes have
Let me
the
stop
cuticle
this
around the
video
body
for a minute.
that they molt as they develop. This cuticle isn't very flexible, which keeps their bodies nice and tight, which means they can have a high internal pressure, which is what gives them this hydrostatic skeleton they use to move. They also lack circular musculature. Other worms have circular musculature.
So here's a nematode moving. Notice how the body kind of flips back and forth.
In this whip-like fashion. Also, with this high pressure, they need a pharynx, this muscular piece up near the head that will push the food into their bodies because their bodies are under this high pressure. And here I've slowed down the movement of this nematode so that you can see this undulatory sine wave type motion. As you can see, it's not a very efficient way to move. So typically these guys live in aquatic environments.
So when we look at the roundworms, notice that many of them are parasitic. And one of the things we're going to see with all the groups of worms, we have numerous parasitic species. We saw with the flatworms, we had tapeworms, and we've got that group called the flukes. With the roundworms, many of them are parasitic. We can think of, I can tell you 4 species right now that are parasitic on people. You know, we're not necessarily worried about roundworms that are parasitic on other animals unless those animals happen to be of economic importance or, you know, domestic pets, but otherwise we don't worry too much. And when we get to the segmented worms, the annelids, we'll see that they're often parasitic too. There's a group of segmented worms called the leeches. So we see some members of each group that are parasitic. So are there any questions about these groups? Notice these are still all invertebrates. We haven't gotten to anything that has a backbone, that has vertebrae yet.